Good morning, everybody. How is everyone today?
Good.
Awesome.
Back well better.
Good. Still in your PJs. That's awesome. I wish I could still be in my PJs. All right. I'm going to mute everybody, and we're going to take a moment to just ground in here before we start, if I can figure out where to mute everybody at. It's been a while. Let's see. There we go. All right. So if you can find a nice comfortable seat where you can sit with a tall spine, we'll just close down the eyes. Feel the sit bones ground down into the chair or the floor beneath you. Take a nice, long, slow, deep breath in through the nose. Let it out through the mouth. In through the nose. Out through the mouth. In through the nose. And out through the mouth. Sealing the lips now, just breathing in and out through the nose if you can. Just evening out the breath here. Taking a nice, long, slow, deep breath in, belly, ribs, collarbones. Exhaling out, collarbones, ribs, and belly. Just preparing the mind as we study today. One last deep breath in. Deep breath out. Blinking the eyes open. And welcome to today's call. So I know we had a study guide that was in the syllabus, so let me pull that up. Let's see, where am I at here? Too many tabs open, guys. All right, so our first question was spinal flexion and spinal flexion, spinal extension. So who would like to maybe give some examples of that? Yeah, deep breathing makes me yawn too, Kimberly, sometimes. Who would like to unmute and share an example of spinal flexion? Or you can raise your hand and I can unmute you. Karen, go ahead.
Hi. Spinal flexion. I've got any standing or seated forward folds. So like cat, any kind of standing forward fold, child's pose, seated forward bends.
Yes. And we always take these movements from what position? Like when we're talking about any of the movements of the body, we're taking them from anatomical neutral. There we go. Yeah. So always going from anatomical neutral. Right. All right. Thank you, Karen. Did anybody have any questions about flexion? Can you explain a little more about spinal flexion and forward folding? I always hear to keep your spine straight, and I'm a little confused. Okay, so when we're talking about coming into a forward fold and we want you to keep the spine straight, we want you to keep the length in the spine so that when you're folding forward, you're kind of more or less hinging at the hips to come into the forward fold before you allow the back to round. That way it protects the lower back. Because if we just bend at the waist when we fold forward, you're kind of putting a lot of pressure on the lower back. So when we straighten, when we say spine straight, we want you to lengthen the spine hinge at the hips before you come into the fold. That way you have that posterior pelvic tilt. Or no, yeah. Pelvis tilts forward. I just taught a class this morning and my brain's all. So yeah, you want the pelvis to tilt forward before you allow, you want to lengthen first and then allow the back to round. If you're in a, especially like in a yin style forward fold, we really want to make sure that that back's protected. If you're coming into, say, an active Janu Shirshasana, I'd say, you want to try and keep as much length in the spine throughout the whole pose as you can while you're engaging all the muscles. Let me see, what was the second part of this? So ultimately, it's okay to have a rounded back if you lengthen first. Yes, we always want to lengthen first. Lengthen the spine is always our priority in any pose that we're coming into. Also might be useful to think about flexion in the spine as the upper body and getting closer to the hips. Yeah, very helpful tip. Thank you, Sasha. Did that clear that up, even though I can't remember anterior and posterior pelvic tilt this morning? Sorry, yesterday was a long day. Okay, any more questions about flexion before we move on? Yeah, you want anterior tilt. Yeah, because you want the pelvic, think of when you're sitting on the floor. And if you have somebody that sits in a posterior pelvic tilt in your class, you of course want to have them sit up on the edge of a blanket, right? But if you can set that blanket like maybe on the wood to the side of the mat and have them sit up on the blanket there, and then they can feel that pelvic tilt coming forward and their sit bones kind of slide behind them a little bit as they're going into that seated forward fold, that kind of helps you get a little bit more of a sense of what that proper pelvic tilt's supposed to be in a forward fold. Make sense?
Hi, I have a question.
Absolutely.
So I have a pretty excessive anterior pelvic tilt already.
Okay.
So I've been trying lately to kind of lessen my anterior pelvic tilt in my forward folds. Should I not?
If you already have an excessive tilt, you're going to want to make sure that you're engaging the core really well. So you're protecting everything that way. And you still do want to have that, you want the pelvis to tilt forward with you because you want the sacrum and the pelvis to move as one unit. So we're protecting that SI joint and everything. Make sense?
Okay. Yes. Thank you.
You're welcome. All right. Okay, so what was the second part of that question? So extension. Who wants to unmute and give some examples of poses that have extension?
I can.
All right, thank you.
I thought about camel pose, wheel pose, upward dog, cobra, fish pose, back bends.
Awesome, yes. Very good. And we always want to try and keep most of that extension and stuff in what part of the spine when we're coming into our back bends. Thoracic, right. Because the low back is already good at making that, and we want to try and lengthen and make that extension in the thoracic spine. Beautiful job. Any questions on extension? No, if you have any, you can just unmute and ask. This is your study call. No questions on extension. If anybody thinks of anything as we move on, we can always come back to it. So we'll move on to question number 2, was with the curves of the spine. So who would like to unmute and tell me what the primary curves are?
I can.
Awesome, thank you.
So the primary curves are the thoracic and sacral curves of the spine, and they're formed at birth or before birth.
Right.
And do you want me to go for the secondary curves?
Sure, if you want to.
We're frozen. Uh-oh, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. So the secondary curves are the cervical and lumbar, which are formed after birth through the lifting of the head, the cervical area, and sitting up would be the lumbar.
Awesome. Thank you. All right, Gemma, I know you're our student teacher today. I'm sorry I did not mention that to begin with. Can you unmute and tell us, first of all, did you have any questions?
No questions at the moment, no.
Okay. Do you want to tell us what the, are the primary curves kyphotic or lordotic?
Primary are kyphotic,
Right.
so they bend outwards.
Yeah, they're like rounded.
Yeah.
Okay, so then that would make the secondary.
Lydotic, and
Yes.
they inwards.
Right. Awesome. And who was Anne was our beautiful student that volunteered to answer that question and said that those lordotic curves, you know, form from us doing all the lifting and things that we do when we're babies and we're lifting our heads when we're laying on our bellies. Okay. And while we're here, what does it mean that the spine curves work sympathetically? Who wants to tackle that one? Anybody remember?
I will. Can. Oh, sorry.
Awesome.
The sympathetic curves, when one moves, the other moves as well.
Yes. Which is important for us to know why.
Because if the cervical curve, for example, was overextended, so would the lumbar curve.
Awesome.
Or vice versa.
Yes. Very good. Thank you so much. Gemma, did you have any key takeaways or anything you wanted to share with us before we move on with the material in the study guide?
Not really, because you've now covered most of what I've
I'm
noted.
so sorry.
No, don't worry, it's fine. I think for me, not a takeaway, but the bit that I'm struggling with is a lot of the movements are so slight, it's hard to be sure that you're thinking the right way, if that makes sense. The flexion and extension sometimes is so slight, it's hard to know for sure.
Yes.
If you think you're right.
The easiest way I think of with, and I don't know, it just may be the way my brain works, for me to remember more like the flexion and extension things that we're doing. Like I always think of extension on an inhale and like flexion on an exhale. You know what I mean? So when you're doing those little movements, you know, it always feels good to inhale when you're doing that extension and opening up. And then when you're flexing, you're more or less closing. And that's kind of how it helps me remember it. I don't know if that makes sense to anybody else. It might not.
No, that's really useful. It means I'm seeing it very different. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Okay, what was our next question here? Our anterior and posterior pelvic tilt. And I think we did touch on that a little bit. So, did anybody want to give an example of anterior pelvic tilt? Anterior forward folds. Yes, because anterior means front and posterior, of course, then means back. Where do we most often see people sitting, or yeah, I just gave it away. Where do we most often see people in a posterior pelvic tilt? Anyone can just unmute, pipe up, chime in.
In a chair?
Yes.
The old office job.
The office job, yes. And sitting on the mat in easy pose. And I like to always say that easy pose isn't always so easy for everybody, because that's one where we do see a lot of people sitting with that posterior pelvic tilt. Netflix watching, exactly. And what's the best thing that we can do to help our students who are in that posterior pelvic tilt? Anybody?
Ask them to knit their ribs in, or would that help?
That would help too. Yeah, core strength is always going to help with either of these, but Heather got it in the chat, put a blanket under the seat, put a blanket or a block or a bolster, like anything that they can sit up on. And if they're sitting on it, they want to kind of be on the edge of it so they can feel where that little tilt is. And like I said earlier, to kind of help with, if you have that anterior pelvic tilt, that's where you want to think of kind of engaging all that core, where you want to try and knit those ribs and hip bones toward one another and get that stability. Like, core strength is so important for so many things that we do. We can't stress enough how important it is. Jen, go ahead.
I was wondering, when you are doing a seated forward fold with a twist, is that also an anterior tilt? Yes.
Yes. Yeah, because if we don't have that little bit of tilt, then it starts to put too much. What's the word I'm looking for? It puts too much pressure in the low back, basically. If you're not getting that tilt and you're trying to just bend from that waist, and you're trying to ask that low back itself to kind of do the folding for you, instead of getting that tilt from the pelvis to extend out of that low back a little bit before you fold, if that makes sense.
Good.
I just got an awesome wobble stool that I love sitting in because it makes it harder to sit with an excessive curved sacrum. Awesome for office or at home. Yeah, I used to sit on like one of those giants, the giant exercise balls, which was pretty good for that too, because it's impossible to sit slumped on. You have to sit up straight and use your core muscles to keep yourself upright. It's kind of fun. All right, were there any questions around the posterior or anterior pelvic tilt? Anything that anybody's still confused about?
Say something more.
That's fine.
I've had an herniated disc in my lower back. So after that, I'm very, very conscious about how my lower back is directed. Because when I had the most pain, I couldn't do a forward fold, but the back bends were very good. So it was really fun to read in the material, and I have experienced it. So
it's kind of fun to learn the how and why of some of that stuff after you've experienced, and then you're like, oh, that's the anatomy behind that. That's why this felt better than this did. Would it be helpful to eliminate excessive pelvic tilt to imagine a cord picking you up from your head? I would think it would, yeah, because I think Brett may have even used that analogy in a couple of her classes before, where you imagine somebody like you're a puppet and somebody's got your strings and they're lengthening you up by your strings. Yeah, that's a good analogy. The cord was the first thing I think of, yes. Yeah, I like to, I've even started cueing it at the beginning of my classes now when I always open with a little bit of a 5-minute seated meditation type thing, and just extending through the crown of your head toward the ceiling kind of helps you just pull everything up and come out of that tilt. Because I even find myself just sitting here now, I'm tilting. It's a lot of work to remember this. All right, if there are no questions, if you have any comments about anything too, little tips or tricks you use like that, just chime in and let us know. And we already touched on question number 5, discussing the segments of the spine that are sympathetic and move as a unit and why this matters. So I was ahead of the game there. And that was all the questions on our study guide, actually, too. Am I correct in thinking posterior tilts are more uncommon? The posterior tilt's the one that's more common. The anterior tilt is the one that is more common. Uncommon. I can't talk today. Posterior more common, anterior more uncommon. And I'm curious, was it Emily that you said you have the anterior? Can you unmute and tell us a little bit, like, I'm just kind of curious as to how you noticed. Was it just in training that you noticed this now, or was it something you noticed before?
No, I've noticed this before. I've had anterior and interior pelvic tilts probably since middle school or high school. And in high school, whenever we were running and stuff, I was in dance. And I would constantly have this low back pain. And we went to the doctor, and the doctor was like, "You're fine." And I was like, "No, something's wrong. My back hurts." And it was maybe earlier on in the year, not this year, like last year, that I was like, okay, something's not right. I've been watching a lot of videos on YouTube on anatomical neutral and stuff. And that's when I noticed, oh, hey, that's what I have. And then I started realizing, and I was like, oh, wow, okay. So I started watching a lot of videos on how to fix it. I'm still working on it, but reading through all of our stuff, I'm like, oh, wow, okay, cool. And so now I'm really focusing on all my yoga poses, tucking my tailbone down, really drawing in my abs, especially my lower abs. And I found this one move that I really, really like, because I never realized how weak my abs were.
Mm-hmm.
And I found this one move. A lot of people know it as dead bug. And you lay on your back, and you bring your knees to a 90-degree angle, so they're directly above your hip. And then so whenever I get into that position, my low back is completely off the ground.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's pretty bad. So I have to really forcibly tuck my tailbone and push my abs really hard to get my spine flat on the ground. And I just kind of sit there for a while. And after a couple of days of doing that, I really feel a complete difference in my TA, in my lower abs. And that might be something for all of you who don't have an excessive anterior pelvic tilt, to kind of cue the people that you see with it. Because it makes, now that I know what that sensation is, I can feel it throughout my entire yoga.
Thank you so much for sharing, Emily. That was very, very helpful. And what you were saying about those low abs, it's so helpful to think of when you're engaging the abs. You want to start at that pelvic floor and engage everything up and in. That's your powerhouse. Yeah, there's a sciatica video. It might be. You may be right, Nick. Okay, there was a question here. I want to make sure. In what poses do we posterior tilt? I think about boat pose. A lot of people do posteriorly tilt in boat pose, but ideally we want to be in neutral in boat pose and try and keep the length in the spine in boat pose. Cow, yes, we are tilting. Cat and cow are really the only ones I think that we want to be actually tilting the pelvis one way or the other. Most of the time we want to try and have neutral spine. It can be useful to think of a posterior tilt in warrior to help counteract the tendency to overarch the low back. Yes. All right, were there any questions about any of the anatomy things that we've gone? It doesn't have to be something that was just on that study guide. It could be anything that we have covered so far from the material that Brett has gone over. I love anatomy. I love discussing it. So if there are any questions you had about anything, let me know. Is down dog an extension of the spine? Yes. You are lengthening the spine in down dog. Most of the time when I engage my abs, I feel tension in my shoulders. What to do? That's very common. And it's common too to feel tension in your face, your forehead and things when you're thinking about really engaging those low abs. Yeah, Karen, you are right. Cow is, I told you I can't think, I can't tell anterior from posterior this morning. Oh, bad TA today. But yeah, it is, it's a conscious effort to try and make sure that you're relaxing somewhat in the upper body when you're really thinking about engaging those low abs and the whole core. Okay. Yeah. How would be anterior because the pelvis is tilting forward so that, as Brett likes to say it, the chai latte is spilling forward. That's cow. And then cat, we're rounding back. I'm sorry for confusing people. Okay, I have neck issues and would get very dizzy when doing any poses where the head is down. Am I doing something wrong? Not necessarily, because there are some medical conditions that are going to cause dizziness when the head is down. Is it something that you've consulted your doctor about? And it could just be an issue too. I don't know how long you've been practicing or anything. Sometimes even just going from having the head down to coming up too fast is just the issue there. If you can kind of come up into a flat back and hold there for maybe several breaths before coming the whole way up to standing, for an example, that may help with that a little bit. I don't know. Okay, confused between extension and flexion. Can anybody provide a comparison? Forward folds or flexion, back bends or extension? Yes. Does that clear that up for you, Kimberly? Please, if you have questions, unmute and ask me. When we twist and are we promoting prompting the sections of the spine? Do we include cervical in the twist, or is that dangerous for overextenders? I always cue for people to look wherever's comfortable for their neck and twist, if that's helpful. Okay, Gemma, did you have something you wanted to say?
Yeah, if that's okay.
Yes, please.
Bit of a random question, but if you gain an ailment, so prime example at the moment, I've just got a frozen shoulder that I'm just getting over, or in the past I've had a broken ankle. Can you get to the point where everything's fine again, or will that always be a little weak area you've got to be aware of, do you think?
I'm sure that if you let it heal properly, and this has always been my thing because I get so anxious to get back into things that I don't let things heal properly and completely, I'm sure it can get back to the way it was, exactly as it was before.
The reason I ask is I've just been doing lots of posture photos today with my husband, and definitely my ankle, the ankle that I broke, definitely points out left now. Never used to, points out to one side. So we were wondering then if that's something that started.
Yeah, with a break, that's, you know, if it didn't set properly or something, that could have something to do with why, yeah. But with, say, like the frozen shoulder, for example, I'm going to have to catch up with the chat here in a minute, guys. But for the frozen shoulder, for example, like if you let that rehabilitate and heal and things properly, that's probably going to, you know, you're probably going to have the same range of motion in that you did before if you take the time with it. Now, like say with the broken ankle, for example, if it didn't set properly, there may be something there that's always going to be just a little off. And that's something to be aware of in your own practice when you're looking at your alignment and things.
Cool. Thank you. Good to know.
You're welcome. Okay, we had a question about the Sagittal coronal planes. Okay, we'll come back to that one. Let me just scroll. Dizziness when the head down is usually due to blood pressure differences. Yes, you are very right, Catherine. Which, I mean, that's something, if it's chronic, if it's really bothering you, honestly, see your doctor. Make sure that there's nothing going on that's causing this. Quick moves can change blood pressure. Taking it slower can help. Yes. Helpful picture. Flexion and movement in sagittal plane, which makes the body move, takes the body forward. Yeah. I'm sorry, I just don't want to miss anything here, guys. My shoulder is always the weakest after frozen shoulder has healed. It fatigues faster than the other joints. Yes, I agree. I have naturally kind of overarched lumbar spine. If I try to draw my ribs in and lengthen my spine, it feels much harder to breathe. Something you have experienced. That's one of those things that kind of takes time to find that and get used to, Jen. I think with injuries, things can return to normal, but it always takes longer than you think it will. It absolutely does. Okay. If I missed anything, holler at me. I will go over the planes of movement as soon as I find it in my notes. Here we go. So, with the sagittal plane, that's the right and left half of the body. So, coronal plane is front and back, because one of the other names for coronal plane is frontal plane. And then the transverse plane is the top and bottom. Are there pictures of this in the manual? It might be helpful. B18. And of course, there's no pictures. That would make too much sense. That might be something to think about. But yeah, so sagittal plane, what I said was right and left half of the body. And that's the plane of movement where, so with flexion, there was somebody that said they were still kind of confused with flexion and extension. Flexion is when you're making the angle more acute, you're bending things. Like you're decreasing the angle between the torso and the thighs, for example. And extension, your angle's getting bigger, you're making the angle, you're wider from the chest to the thighs. There was a great picture in the Facebook group for the planes of movement. Awesome. Yeah, I'm not sure.
Can I ask something on that?
Yes.
On the planes. I understand what they are, like how you're slicing yourself and where's extension and flexion and abduction and adduction. But why do we need them? Why do we need these planes at all? Like, how are they useful for us? Well, that's what I don't understand. Why are we learning them?
Just because it's a good anatomy. It's a, what am I trying? What's the word I'm looking for here? It's a good base of where you're like telling somebody to move something from, I think. I can't think of the word I want here.
So that's like a reference.
Reference point. Thank you. I'm sorry. Yesterday was a really long day, guys. Yes, it's a good reference point for alignment and where you want somebody to be coming from that anatomical neutral, and what it helps too when you're body reading, I think, to know what section of the body's supposed to be doing what, if that makes sense.
Okay, thank you.
I hope that made sense. Cueing example, when Warrior 2, try and keep yourself along the sagittal plane. That is a good idea, Catherine. If you're, not a lot of, like, my students will look at me like I were crazy if I told them that, because they would have no idea what I was talking about. I teach like older women. I'm taking it as me being able to better understand what the body is doing and what I want my students to do. Yeah, like it's not going to make a whole lot of sense for like your students, but for you as the teacher, it's a good, and I thank you for saying reference. It's a good reference point to know where you're starting from with a movement, because we always want to start with that anatomical neutral and know what's supposed to be doing what from which plane of the body. Did I even clear up? I can't even remember who had the question about the planes of movement. Mandy, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hi there.
Hi.
I have, it's not on the planes of movement anymore. Thank you for the answers, everyone. That was very helpful because I was very confused until now. So for me, one of the things I was hoping from, I love anatomy, but specifically from the way that this is designed, was to understand, and I don't even know what the question is here, but anybody jump in. I struggle so massively with twists. And so I learned a little bit more why from Kristen and Brett, but I don't know what I'm doing wrong, or if I am doing something wrong. I know that I have a really tight quadris lumborum, like really tight, so that cobra is difficult for me unless I'm really engaging my lower abs. But I don't, like, does anyone else struggle with twists, like where I dread them?
What question do I want to ask here?
Like I can't breathe when I'm twisting.
Okay. So like you're maybe just going a little bit too deep into the twist, like just back out of the twist until you find a place, and maybe even experiment with open twists where you're not, like instead of coming into like the prayer twist where you're like bringing the arm over to the knee, maybe just experiment with an open twist going the other way where your chest and your lungs and everything are staying open.
Okay.
That might help if it's like a spinal, like if it's a flexibility thing, doing the open twist might help open things up a little bit more.
Right.
To then be able to come into the more compressed twists. You know what I'm saying? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And I guess the question, I didn't want to make it about myself, but in that sense, like when I'm teaching students, I can, a lot of teachers will kind of just say, breathe and turn deeper. There's no like, do it to you. And I don't do that, but is there like, especially with an older population that maybe is having that same issue, is there a specific, suggestion you have for how to cue so that they know not to overdo it because I'm telling them to?
Okay, well, somebody had put a great thing in the lengthening more helps increase the lung capacity. So the more you can lengthen yourself before you come into that twist, and that's the thing I like to cue is just, lengthen before you twist, like extend and then twist. When I'm teaching twists, I try and like teach, say for the seated twist, for example, you're sitting in staff pose, you bend the one knee, you can keep the foot on the inside or cross it to the outside, which is going to make a difference in the compression you're feeling in the twist there.
Okay.
Just as a starting point. So you want to lengthen before you twist, and then you're just gently hugging that knee. You're not like really cranking into that twist. I don't even cue most of the time for anybody to put their hand on the floor behind them. Right. I kind of just have people just hug the knees so they can keep that length in the spine instead of kind of sitting back as we kind of tend to do if we're in a seated twist, for example. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does, and it's very helpful. Is there the same benefit in terms of like the detox aspect to reclined twists?
No, so when you're a twist, I think a twist is a twist as far as like, like the benefits it has for the body and the spine.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, length helps.
Can I also add something? Maybe it would be helpful.
Yes, please.
I think if you can take the arms out of your twist and twist only as much as your abs and your core muscles can allow you, then you wouldn't go too far and that wouldn't restrict your breathing, I think.
Yes, thank you. And somebody had actually put that in the chat here that Kristen had said to put arms up and go only as far as the body takes you, and then, just let the arms kind of rest where they fall in the twist. Mandy, I'm going to go ahead and lower your hand, unless you had another question. Okay, I find especially with binds, not always with twists, but sometimes with binds. Yeah, I hardly ever bind because I just don't think my proportions are right for it, and it makes me feel like I can't breathe. So only twist with the thoracic so you feel like you're twisting from the navel upwards. Yes, Nick, that is a very, very, very good point, because we don't want to ask our sacrum to twist at all. Remember, the pose is not the goal. You're gradually improving spinal mobility and massaging internal organs, not forcing it. Thank you. Great question. For twisting, are there things that we can do to prepare the body before going into the twist itself? I like to do lateral side bends before twists. Maybe some, like, have the arms up and then shoulders down, like kind of opening across the chest and things too, I think helps. Okay. Hope that answered that question. Great reminder, refreshing that yoga is seen. A shift from the pose being the goal. Okay, I hope I didn't miss anything else. Man, did you have another question, comment? No? Okay. I love heart openers before twisting. Yeah, I like to, there's like an arm vinyasa I like to teach to my class, where you inhale, arms up, then exhale, shoulder blades down, open across the chest. Inhale up and then round forward with the shoulders and the arms and everything, and kind of open up the whole spine before we do any twisting. I so appreciate the safety aspect of this course and how being extreme heat spines poses is not the basic. I think the PODs are important, so thanks to all. Yes, I love the safety aspects we try and build into this. Best beginner friendly twists, just seated. Yeah, seated twists are pretty beginner friendly. Like a low lunge twist, that's a pretty easy one for beginners. The high lunge prayer twist is, yeah, you're kind of getting, that's a little bit more difficult, because beginners are most of the time still trying to find their balance. And that's a big thing for a lot of my students personally, is the balance piece. But yeah, like I said, a low lunge twist, that's pretty accessible to beginners. Even like the chair twist, but with just the open arms, where you're not coming into the prayer hands and coming down, that would be pretty accessible to beginners. Just make sure they're squeezing that block between the thighs if they have, feet hip width apart. Any other questions about any anatomy things? Makes me wonder now if there should ever be a huge group class, because there's really no way to ensure that many students stay safe, in my humble opinion. Yeah, I'm grateful for my small class sizes, that I can keep an eye on everybody. And lunge with open arms, yes. Yeah, I like to teach the lunge twist, where you still have, like, the hands not clear down on the floor, but you have the hand up on a block and you're spinning the chest open toward the bent knee. I think that's a really nice one to open across the back and everything without feeling too out of balance or compressed or anything. How about people having a hard time with back bends? Yeah, I honestly myself have a hard time with back bends. And I try and remind, and I don't teach back bends a whole lot. I do like camel, locust, cobra. So I try and remind my students to, and not think of the lower back at all. We want to keep that stable, but we're lengthening up with those collarbones and everything. That's where our back bend's coming from, is our lengthening up. And then, lengthening the collarbones toward the ceiling for camel, or lengthening the collarbones forward for your cobra pose, are the ways I like to try and cue the back bend to keep it safe. Karen, go ahead.
Hi, I was just wondering, is our whole spinal column capable of rotation, even though parts of it are small, or do some parts not rotate?
I don't remember. There was something somewhere in the material that said what degree of rotation each part of the spine had. Let me see if I can find that. Yeah, because it's a lot less in like the lumbar.
Like 5% or something.
Yeah, there's like a percentage of how much, and I don't remember. If I find it, I can try and post it in the Facebook group later, because I honestly can't remember what section it was in. Let me see. Okay, I found it. B.2.3 was the section that had the spine section by section, and the lumbar spine only had 5 degree per vertebrae for, you know, their rotation, and that was the only one that had the listing for. It might even be in my saved bookmarks somewhere, but if I can find that, I'll post it in the Facebook group where it had the degrees of rotation for each part of the spine. But yeah, there's limited, it's different in each part of the spine.
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome. Let's see, did I miss something? I used to have trouble because my back is flexible. It was hard to only bend in the upper back once I realized my lower abs. But I wasn't using. I started using them and it got easier, still challenging, but a lot of pressure on the low back is, less pressure on the low back is nice, yes. Back bends are scary for anyone who struggles. It's important to breathe fully because otherwise you can freeze up and make it more painful on yourself. Yes, very true. Yeah, we always want to make sure the breath is full and complete in any pose that we're in. And if it's not, we need to back out. For me, I use restorative and yin poses with props to ease into more intense back bends. Yes. Supported fish is one of my favorite poses ever. Another way I create sequences with back bends is to ensure the reward of child's pose. Yeah. That's, I found too, like sometimes if I come right from, say, doing like a whole locust series or something, I kind of like to do a couple of cat-cows just to bring that spine a little bit more into neutral before coming into child's pose. Because sometimes that's a big transition from one extreme to the other, if that makes sense. All right, did anybody else have any more questions or comments, anything that you needed clarification on? Unmute or put it in the chat. If there's something that you're still confused on that I made you confused about, please tell me. No, nothing. Okay. In 3.2, we talked about the pelvis and that we shouldn't go from square hips to open hips in the opposite in many classes I have taken. Is there a transition from open to square hips? What are your thoughts of this? I personally never teach anything in my classes where I'm going from open hips to square hips. When I'm teaching, like if I'm going to do a warrior series with like warrior 2, triangle, side angle, half moon or anything, I'll have my students from Tadasana at the top of the mat turn and step wide on their mat so they're facing the long edge of the mat. That's just how I always teach it, because I always found that like if I'm doing a class on YouTube where they have me transition from warrior 1 to warrior 2, I don't like that transition. So I just decided that wasn't anything I was ever going to teach. And like, you know, like Brett said in our modules, we don't teach things that way in uplifted yoga either, because of the iffiness and, you know, for the low back. when you start teaching your own classes, I mean, that's something that you can decide if you want to do that. But I do think that the safest way to transition from, forward-facing hips is just to do it safely from Tadasana and just turn and step wide. I think people have come into it like you can come from a lunge position is not quite as bad. If you come into like if you're in down dog, come leg up and back, foot forward, and then you're like in that runner's lunge position, you can kind of turn people to the side from there and more safely get into it because you're in a position where you can kind of keep both knees bent. You're keeping that space in the low back and the sacrum before you're then straightening and lengthening and engaging all those muscles into that warrior two position. Does that make sense? Not only can it be dangerous for the joints, but I felt pain in the inner groin when going from open to square hips quickly. Yeah, it's not a transition that I like. Did that make sense the way I explained that, Jen? Okay. Any other questions about anything?
I have a question about sun breaths from 2.2.6.
2.6. All right, let me pull that up in my manual here. All right, what was the question?
So I was looking on some YouTube videos, and I see that some people do really aggressively when they let out the air, and as they forward fold. Wouldn't that cause more strain to your back?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember the sun breath. Is that, yeah, I think I remember which one that is. And I think when Brett's cueing, she's really started to emphasize lately that when you're doing any type of breath that you don't want to do it like really forcefully.
Okay. Yeah, that was also my question. Like, can we also just like slow it down and do it more slowly, more in our pace? I'm not sure if that's like, would that be appropriate and still be called sun breaths?
I'm always going to tell you to go with what feels good for your body and what you think is going to work for your students. Like that's always going to be my default answer on anything, because if it's not feeling good to you, then it's not working for you. So yeah, we can go with what there's, if the sun breath is supposed to be done really quickly, but if it doesn't feel good for you, you're not getting any benefits from it. So if you can slow that down and get benefits from it, then absolutely slow it down.
Okay, thank you.
Let's see. I asked Steph about this. She said you would know. Is there a digital copy somewhere of the segments chart? Oh, I think that's in the manual actually. Let me get my manual up here, this beast. Is this the one you're talking about? That's the one? Yeah. It's on page C14. Yeah, it was kind of easy to miss in there. I think in the new manual, we put it in the table of contents at the beginning, so people didn't miss it because they had a hard time finding it last round too, I believe. Did I say C14? Yes, C14. You're welcome. All right, any other questions?
I just have a comment. Can I just make a quick comment?
Sure.
About the segments. I don't know about anyone else, but I've found it really funny because I practice at home and then I go to different studios that I enjoy and teachers, but I have to say that after learning those segments thing, I have a complete new perspective on the efficacy of the teaching that is going on. So I just really like that chart. That's why I asked, because I think that makes all the difference, frankly, in how the quality of the teacher. and what you're doing with your students and keeping them safe. So I just wanted to share that because I have a whole new perspective on the studios that I go to.
I've never been to like public classes. So my first experience with being in a public setting was like awful for me, because the whole time I'm doing the class, I'm looking at the people around me, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I just want to run over and like cue her into better alignment for that pose. It's something that you kind of have to get out of your own head a little when you go to a public class after having done this training, because it's kind of shocking to notice that not everybody teaches the way you were taught to teach. And
right. Yeah. So
yep.
Thank you.
Yep. Just noticing things I hadn't noticed before. Yeah. Also the logic of sequencing. I can't wait to get into sequencing with you guys. So much fun. All right. Does anybody else have any other questions? Questions, comments, observations?
Can I ask a question on a specific pose, not like general anatomy? Is that
okay. That's fine.
It's about Janu Shirshasana. It's just last time we kind of whizzed through. So
yeah, and I can definitely go over that again, because that was one of them that I don't think, when there was a really bad Zoom glitch on our last call, and part of our call did not get recorded, so we're not sure what happened with that. So I can go over Janu Shirshasana if you would like.
I actually was on that call, but it's just, I don't think we have time for everything maybe. I have a question about the extended legs position, because when I look at different teachers, some of them have their leg just straight in front of them and some a little bit to the side, and I personally prefer it to be to the side because I kind of feel it gives more space to my bended legs knee, and it's more comfortable. But is there a correct position, or does it not matter?
Let me find what page that is on in the manual, because I can't remember off the top of my head. Because there's two different versions of Janu Shirshasana that we have in the manual. One is the one where the leg is like straight forward, and the other one, the leg is like extended out to the side and almost like a half.
Yeah.
Half
so
V.
I mean the one that is straight forward, but some teachers teach it with this leg a bit,
a bit to the side. Yeah.
Yeah. So pointing to the corner of the mat, basically. Is that okay?
I'm going to say it's okay if it's going to feel better on your student's hip and low back, because it might be something anatomical, it might be something muscular that's keeping, yes, ideally in perfect yoga alignment, we're starting from that Dandasana staff pose, both feet are flexed equally, and then we bend that one leg, bring that foot to the inner thigh, and that extended leg is still on the floor with that foot powerfully flexed, the legs all engaged, and then we lengthen up and fold forward. But if there's some for impingement, feeling you're getting somewhere, move that leg out to the side a little bit. It's not gonna make a huge difference. Just make sure that you're keeping that engagement in the foot, so you're protecting the hamstring and the lower back.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, let's see if I missed anything in the chat. I missed a ton in the chat. How do you manage walking around and helping students if it's a beginner class? I've been teaching at a Crunch, which is a general gym, and it's hard to walk around because most people need to see the teacher and know what to do. Students just walk in and have usually never been to a regular yoga studio. I teach at a gym as well. I honestly do not get to walk around a lot because I have the same issue where you're getting a lot of new students that come in. You do your best to cue the most basic version of those poses the safest way you possibly know how. at first. And then if you're staying in the pose for several breaths, you can give options to maybe, if you're comfortable here and want to like go further, like, you can go to this next step. But I always start with that most basic cueing, basic part of the pose first, if that helps answer that question, Kelly. The balance between demo and teaching and walking the room. Yeah, it's a big, like, we encourage you as much as possible to, balance demo and walking your room, but you have to be able to watch your students so you can see who needs a little bit of cueing to maybe refine something a little bit. Can you get a helper to go with you, someone to continue modeling the pose while you assist? That's a good idea if you have a pretty advanced student that can demo poses for you. That's an option. Yeah, having assistants. I don't know. My class, like I said, I'm fortunate to have smaller classes, so I don't like to do hands-on with students, probably because I don't like it myself. Yeah, a lot of people aren't comfortable with touch, and hands-on, that's a really touchy subject with a lot of. Are we going to get through body reading call with Brett later, or do you? I think Brett does the body reading. This was just the anatomy study call. I went to a class as a participant that had 120. Whoa. Wow. 128 students. That's insane. Okay, that helped. Also, I didn't want my students comparing to me either. Balance, as you said. Yeah. Yeah, I think it's really important for you as the teacher not to, even if you're able to, not to demo the most extreme version of the pose first. Because your students are always going to look at you. They're always going to try and copy you. That's why I like to demo using like the props, like the blocks, and I use a blanket under my knees when I'm demoing, and I sit on the blanket when I'm, when we're doing the seated things. Like, do all those things so your students think it's normal. Maybe holding the pose for a longer time might help gaining time to walk around and help those in need. Yes. Yeah, that's why I like to teach Hatha style. I don't teach Vinyasa style very often. I like to teach Hatha, so we're holding our poses anywhere from like 3 to 5 breaths. And it gives you a little bit more time to sneak in a couple more cues here and there. You can look around and see, oh, she needs to turn her foot in a little bit. So you can cue, look down, make sure that those back toes are turned in, or, things like that. In one of my classes, the teacher always asks us students to lift our hands when we feel uncomfortable in a pose, and then she is checking in with us. I find it helpful and it allows the teacher to gives a sense of who needs help. That's a very good idea. Thank you for sharing that, Laura. We have so many asana to go through that we kind of have to start going through them before we do the alignment and body reading things, because it's just so much material. My students know they need to pick blocks and blankets for class. Yeah. Is the big difference between yin and hatha the time you hold in each pose? Okay, so with yin and hatha, the difference between the two, we're kind of getting off topic, but that's okay. With yin poses, you're holding yin poses for several minutes, and you're not muscularly engaging. With hatha yoga, we're holding the poses for anywhere from 3 to 5 breaths, and you're really